Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Thelton Henderson, Jr., United States District Judge in San Francisco. Judge Henderson, welcome back to Berkeley.
It's my pleasure to be back. It's good to be back on campus after so many years.
You've said somewhere, I've always believed that my story is the American story. If I can make it, anybody can. What did you mean by that?
Well, I meant that I grew up believing that if you studied hard and applied yourself, that you'd get someplace. And growing up in Watts, that really meant something, because what it meant was getting up and out of Watts and onto the larger world. And it's worked for me. I think that's what I meant.
Let's talk a little about your formative experiences as a young person. Tell us a little about your parents and how they shaped your character.
Okay, I think it would be primarily my mother. I was born in Louisiana, and we left there when I was 3 and went to Los Angeles, where I grew up. My mother did domestic work, as we called it. She cleaned people's houses, and I think largely through her influence, she made me study. I liked athletics, and my mother said, you can play sports, but you have to study. And she's the one that gave me the idea that I was destined to go to college. And indeed, I think I would have been in bad trouble with her if I hadn't. So my mother was a primary influence, as I recall, although I shouldn't short sell my father. He worked hard and paid the bills also. But my mother was the main educational influence, and I look back on her as telling me to have, is my homework done, and making sure I did it. And one time in high school, when I was getting pretty good in sports, I wanted to take shop courses, which were easier, like the other kids on the football team. And she said, nope, you're going to keep an academic course. So she's the one that kept me on schedule and pushing me toward college.
Any mentors or teachers stand out as you think back about that early period?
Yeah, there were some important people. 2 that come immediately to mind was a wonderful counselor at Jefferson High School named Isaac McClellan. And one day I was finishing football practice, and he came out and met me and said, have you ever thought about going to college? And of course, as I said, I've sort of thought about it, but I didn't know whether I was really going to do it, and I hadn't done anything toward going to college. He had just gotten some scores. Back then, they had a test called the Iowa test that all high school students took, and it turned out that I got a good score on it. And wonderful Mr. McClellan took it upon himself to go find the several of us who got good scores. And the reason I went to UC Berkeley was that was his alma mater. He got the applications, actually paid the filing fee for me, and headed me toward here. So he was very important in my life. And another was a football coach, a tough ex-Marine who lost his leg in World War II, named Mike Marienthal. And he took a bunch of tough black kids there that had intimidated all the past football coaches, and he molded us into a team. That was an important part of my getting a football scholarship, and he's a continuing influence. I still see him.
And your high school had other famous graduates, you were saying earlier.
It did. Ralph Bunch was the most famous graduate of Jefferson High when I was there. And as you know, he went on to great international things in this country.
Right, right. What about books? Any books that you read as a kid that you recall to this day?
I wish I could say so, but no. I think I read textbooks in school and a lot of sports books, but I didn't read the books that I found that most of the kids had read when I got here to Berkeley, unfortunately.
Now tell me who Speedball was.
Where did you get that?
I do my research. That was your...
I was Speedball. I had a nickname of Speedball. I was, as you can see, I'm not very big, but I was kind of fast.
I see.
And that was the way I was able to play football. I was faster than most of the other guys. Not better, but faster.
And you were an all-city halfback?
I made all-city halfback, yes.
So when you came to Cal, it was both this academic push by your mentors, but also you came here to play football.
I came here to play football, yes.
Right. And then what happened? Did you actually played for the team, and then
Actually played for Pappy Waldorf.
one of our great coaches.
One of our
We
great
have a new
coaches.
statue up for him.
That's right,
Yeah.
I've seen that.
Yeah.
And during the time, a lot of young people at Cal don't realize this, but Cal had great football team back in the early 50s. When I came here, they had just been to the Rose Bowl 3 years in a row, and they were the #1 team in the country. And that was an incentive to come. And there's a wonderful story. My grandmother, who died at 99 a few years ago, didn't really understand football, but she understood her grandson played football for Cal, and whenever football would come up, I should mention, by the way, Cal's football fortunes plummeted in the early 50s, and they've never really been back to that height.
Maybe we don't want you to mention that, actually. Okay.
But I got hurt in my sophomore year, and whenever football would come up around the family, my grandmother would look up from her sewing and say, "Cal used to have good football teams until Thelton got hurt." That's her relationship with Cal's fortunes. Was my injury was the end of.
And I guess at one of the games you were, while you were still playing, you were complimented by the then governor of the state of California.
Earl Warren,
right.
exactly. In fact, in the game I was injured in, I was on a stretcher and was being taken off the field, and he was kind enough to come down and escort me off the field and shake my hand, and it was a wonderful experience to meet him.
And of course, he went on to the Supreme Court and was influential in putting together the coalitions that made some of the great decisions. Were any of your other of your mentors, in terms of heroes and so on, as you're entering college, were the names? Well, I guess Thurgood Marshall and Martin Luther King really came later, right?
They came later, yes.
Right. So let's ask you then, how did the civil rights movement begin to affect your consciousness, and when did it begin to affect your consciousness?
Well, it's interesting. Not really until law school. Up until then, I wasn't really involved or knowledgeable about it. And indeed, I didn't learn of who Marcus Garvey was until I was in law school.
Right.
And there was a fellow year ahead of me named Donald Warden, who had gone to Howard University and was very knowledgeable about black history. He had gone through the black educational system. He formed an organization called the African American Association, which was sort of far-sighted back then.
At the law school here on
the law school.
Right.
And we would meet. He had a house in Oakland. We would meet at his house on Sundays, and our assignment was to read a book about black history in the intervening week, and then someone would give a report on it, and we would discuss it. And that was really the start.
And this would have been what years now?
This was 1960.
60,
This
okay.
was started in 1960.
So this was a kind of a local manifestation of this consciousness that was emerging.
Exactly, and people in the African American, Ron Dellums, just retired from Congress, was in there, and a very young kid who used to hang out there named Huey Newton was in the African American. So it was a lot of people.
So there must, in the Bay Area, must have been in some ways an exciting place to be in terms of intellectual ferment on these issues.
Absolutely, yes.
In one of your articles that I read on the role of civil rights lawyer, you talked about the impact of Rosa Parks and how she launched the civil rights movement. Let's talk a little about that, and how that moment of defiance by her on the bus became such an inspiration for so many.
Well, I think it did spark the civil rights movement. As you know the story, she was coming home from work. She did ironing for a family, and was told to go to the back of the bus, and there were no seats in the back of the bus, which meant she would have to stand. And I think at that point she had said, I doubt if it happened in that one day, she was probably building toward it, but I think on that one day she just said no, and insisted on sitting on an open seat which was reserved for whites. and as you know, was arrested. And I think that many were indignant about it and were inspired by that act of bravery, because it was an act of bravery to defy segregation laws back then in the early 60s and late 50s. And I think that sparked many people that we can resist this, and it's worth resisting.
So let's go back to your life now. Your BA from Cal, law school, and then you have your legal degree now, and how do you get thrust into this vortex of activity that's occurring in the South? Where's your first job?
My first job, I was a very lucky guy. I got out of Bolt Hall in 1962, and I have to give you a little background on this. Back then, white firms didn't interview black law graduates, so I didn't know where I was going to work. And the typical lawyer graduating in those days, you would find a successful black lawyer and who had overflow business. You'd rent some space from him, and he would give you what were really his dog cases, and you would try to make money and build your own practice. Well, that was a prospect for me, and I had the choice of whether I would stay up here or go back to Los Angeles. One day in my last semester at Bolt, there was a note on the blackboard, "Come see the dean." And I thought, uh-oh, maybe I've been missing a few classes this last semester, because I knew I was going to graduate. But it turned out to be a call from John Doerr, who was second in command of the Civil Rights Division.
In the Justice Department.
In the Justice Department.
Yeah.
And John had been going down south at the instructions of the Kennedys, who had just come into power, and asking people in the federal government, "Do you have any blacks working for you?" Finally, one day, one of them said, "Do you have any blacks working for you?"
I see.
And there had never been a black working for the Civil Rights Division, so he thought he better remedy that immediately. And luckily enough, his alma mater was Bolt Hall. He called the dean and said, "Do you have any blacks graduating?" And I was one of two. And that's how I got the job. So when in fact, when I took the bar and was driving back to Washington, D.C. in late August, I heard, listening on the radio, which was on national radio, the integration of the University of Mississippi with James Meredith. That was happening then. So when I joined the Justice Department, there were a lot of exciting things happening, and I was thrown in the forefront. The Kennedys had decided to emphasize voting rights. Their theory was that if we can get the blacks the vote in the South, they will then vote out the segregationists and right the wrongs of the South. So that was the focus, and I started prosecuting voting rights cases in the states of Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana.
So tell us a little about what that then involved, basically. Traveling to these states, getting witness testimony, building a case?
That's right. It involved traveling to the particular voting precinct. In Louisiana, it was parishes, and the other states, it was counties. And finding a pattern in practice, those were the operative words under the legislation, of discrimination. And what that usually involved, you'd look at voting records, or you'd get the FBI to photograph all the voting records. And you usually had a long list of whites who were registered, and a very short list of whites who weren't registered. You'd have a very short or non-existent list of registered blacks, and a very long list of unregistered. You'd analyze those to try to find out why those statistics existed. And generally what you would find was, after a lot of study, they all did it differently, but the most prevalent pattern was that they had very difficult questions, and then helped the whites answer the questions and didn't help the blacks. And so you could see answers from the whites in different handwritings that you knew were not their handwriting. You'd find that pattern in practice, and then you'd go into court and get an injunction against that practice and get them registered.
Several questions come to mind. First, this was dangerous business for a young black attorney.
It was.
Were there any physical threats on your life, or any actually physical violence on your person?
There were physical threats. I was anxious all the time, and there were threats, and there was some violence. I still have a scar on my hand from an arrest where a sheriff smashed my hand with a billy club because he wanted to see my driver's license, and I took it out and held it in in the cellophane, not the cellophane, but the covering that
Right,
you have on
right.
it. And he smashed my hand and said, "Take it out of that thing." And
God.
it was that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But that was the only actual physical violence.
Death threats? Did you get death threats?
I
Or
did get death threats.
Yeah.
I did get death threats. And fortunately, when I was in the South, this was 1962, there weren't any places for me to stay in these towns except in Birmingham. There was a black motel, the A.G. Gaston Motel. In the other places, there was no place to stay, so I stayed on military bases in the evening, and that, I felt secure there. I was actually pleased that I could stay on a military base rather than a hotel. And I wasn't allowed to stay in black homes because that would have identified me with the civil rights movement. I was supposed to be neutral as a government employee.
And we'll talk about that in a moment. It sounds like a time so long ago, but it really isn't so long ago. Yeah. All right. What about relations with the FBI? Because they presumably were an arm of the Justice Department. How did that play out in your work?
Well, the FBI, and we can say it with much more assurance now, they weren't a big partner of the Civil Rights Division. We didn't feel that they were interested in what we were doing. And so they did the technical work. They would photograph the voting records, and we had no problem with that. But we never felt comfortable that they were really investigating civil rights violations. And one story that I can tell that I think personifies that, I mentioned earlier to you before we came here about a day in Selma. It was a big voting rights registration day in which 4 young blacks were going to defy the local authorities by taking food and drink to black voters waiting in line, and they were told by the sheriff they couldn't. And I was orchestrating this, and I told I knew they were going to go over and that they were going to get beat. And I ordered pictures of this. And so when we saw the pictures, which were taken by the FBI, they showed the blacks walking across with the food, and then they approached a phalanx of whites, and you saw arms raised with billy clubs, and then the camera sort of wander off, and you never get the beating. Well, that was the way the FBI did many things in those days. So they weren't diligent pursuers of justice or civil rights, I thought.
The other constraint must have been the judges you were arguing before.
Oh, serious.
Tell us about that.
Well, they were probably less hospitable than the FBI. They were actively hostile to our cause, to our cases, to the people we represented, and they would use racial slurs even in court. You generally, I've made the statement that some of my judicial heroes are not these judges in the district court, and it's ironic that I sit on a district court now, but the appellate court judges. There were some very brave judges in the Fifth Circuit, John Minor Wisdom and others that come to mind, who were the judges that enforced the law. So you had to get to the trial court, get them to rule against you, and then justice would be done when you would appeal it up to the Fifth Circuit.
And many of these justices at the higher level were death threats.
They got death threats, and were ostracized in their community. And one of the more poignant, there's a book that I still have and read often called Unlikely Heroes, which is about 5 of these judges. And then there is a segment about John Minor Wisdom, who was his family was a leading family in his community. And after his rulings, upholding the law is simply all he did, he would go to church. And his family had founded this church, had been founders of the church, and no one would sit with them. They'd get up and move. So, so they suffered a lot for doing the right thing.
So for how many years did you do this work?
2 years. I did this for 2 years.
2 years. And your career in this regard ended rather abruptly because of a particular incident. Tell us about that incident. What happened to you?
Okay, and that's why it was only 2 years.
Yes, I understand,
longer. Well, I was working on a voting rights case one day, and this particular day it involves going out into the rural areas and interviewing people. When did you apply to vote, and what did you do, and finding out educational. And after a long day of that, I was coming back to the A.G. Gaston Motel. This was in Birmingham, and Martin Luther King was also staying there. And just as I was driving into the motel, King was driving out. And we stopped and chatted for a few minutes, and then he said he was on the way to Selma. A minister was driving him to Selma because this was right after the incident I described where the 4 blacks were beat. And the process then, King, it took 6 months to a year to get a community ready to really demonstrate an uprise against the patterns. And he was going up there on one of those sort of rallies. He told me that the car he was being driven in had a bad tire, and sort of casually asked, "Can we use your car?" So I said, of course. I was finished for the day. So we drove back into the motel, and I got out, gave the minister who was driving my keys, and they went in, and I went in and ate and went to bed. Well, we didn't know that we were being followed every place. He certainly was, and I often was, and I know now from my Freedom of Information Act papers that I was being followed by George Wallace's minions. Whoever was watching outside assumed that I was driving King instead of gave him the car. So the newspaper the next day had a headline, Justice Department, high-ranking government official. I was just out of law school, but for Southern purposes, I became a high-ranking government official who was doing the Kennedy's bidding by chauffeuring Martin Luther King around. A huge scandal followed, and that was the end of my career with the civil rights.
So you became a political football.
Exactly, exactly.
Tell us about what stands out in your mind in terms of the courage of the people who you witnessed acting politically and being the civil rights movement.
It was unbelievable courage. I mean, I saw young kids who would come to a march or a demonstration knowing they were going to get arrested. Indeed, many of them would bring their toothbrush and a face towel, expecting to be arrested, and beyond, and beat. And I thought that was tremendous courage, and courage that I'm not sure that I would have had, because one of the sort of the untold stories about the civil rights movement and what we saw on the front pages of King coming in, the New York Times and the national press looking at this and everyone applauding the bravery and the cause. But when they pulled out of town, the untold story was the misery when these people were left alone. The press was gone. They lost their jobs. They were beat. They were threatened. Houses were blown up. And they knew this because I've heard them talk about it prior to the demonstrations. And I thought that was tremendous courage.
Let's talk a little about the Kennedys. You had the opportunity to work in their Justice Department in the field. Looking back, what is your assessment of the role that they played during this critical period when the movement was starting up in the South, building velocity, and until the period when President Kennedy was assassinated?
Okay, I think they played a very important role, a psychological role, if nothing else, and certainly more than that, but in the sense that I think it wasn't coincidental that the civil rights movement picked up steam during this time, because I think the Kennedys gave hope, because they listened, and I think they indicated to the civil rights leaders that they cared and that they had an ear in Washington. I think this was an important part of the activity you saw, whereas I think in the previous administration, there was no feeling that if we demonstrate and do things, we're going to get the attention of the administration. So I think they played a very important part in that.
But there were limitations in a sense, because some of their political appointments of judges in the South didn't match the idealism that they had with regard to civil rights.
They didn't, and I think that was a tragedy. They appointed they essentially traded off, I believe, the federal appointments in the South for other political advantages in the South. And so they let the senator, whose name I don't recall now, perhaps it was Eastland.
Eastland, yeah.
They let Eastland designate who the judges would be, and he appointed four in particular really racist, segregationist judges who were really awful judges for civil rights, and that was a bad thing.
The role of the civil rights movement was very clear in this period, but once through the efforts of President Johnson, you got a voters' rights bill, you got the Civil Rights Act. The role of the civil rights lawyer had to change, and you were really a part of that. What work did you undertake in the civil rights field once you left the Justice Department and came back to California?
Okay, well, we got some legislation, Title VII and other things like that, so I undertook the role of enforcing the anti-discrimination laws, Title VII, which says you cannot discriminate in employment. And I was essentially a Title VII lawyer. I filed a lot of lawsuits against a lot of companies that discriminated. And interestingly enough, following it on to the present day, where I sit on these kinds of cases as a judge, it was a good time to be a lawyer because the discrimination was much more blatant, and it was fairly easy to find people who had been discriminated against. It's not as easy now. You've seen a progression. It's much harder to be a civil rights lawyer now because the discrimination that still exists in our country is much more subtle. There are very few people in any area. Back then, I could go look for a place to live, and they would say, "We don't rent to blacks." They don't say that anymore. They say, "Gee, we just rented it to someone else." And so it's harder, and the same in employment. They rarely say we don't hire blacks as they did then.
How does your role in the civil rights movement in this earlier period affect your work and your thinking as a judge today?
Oh, I think it affects it, and that's why I think it's good to have diversity on the bench. And the story I often tell is that I have some colleagues on the court whom I admire greatly and are good friends of mine. We come from different backgrounds. The difference between me and another colleague who comes from a more privileged background and a more sheltered background, growing up in the suburbs and maybe never even having gone to school with a black, is that one of them will get a case, and I'll give you an example of an actual conversation. This judge came into the judge's lunchroom and said, "Gee, I'm in this trial, and this black worker at this factory says he goes to the locker room where he has his locker, and they have a sign on there that says, 'Nigger, go home,' and they hung a gorilla on his thing. And gee, I just don't believe that." And the difference is, I believe that.
I see.
And that's what the diversity brings to the, that's what my experiences bring. I hear things, and I can say, yes, I even experience it. I believe that happens. And then, of course, you have different outcomes because these cases that are fact-intensive, where you have to get two testimonies, judges are able to determine what the facts are of a case. And I'm not saying I discriminate. I'm saying I bring an experience where I recognize certain things that my colleagues, well-meaning, don't recognize.
When we look back at the example of Martin Luther King and Andy Young, one of the most amazing things is their respect for the law as they violated unconstitutional and evil laws. How does that affect you today, and that example, in the sense that in your work it's really necessary to make a distinction of being obedient to the law, but understanding that through political action sometimes laws need to be changed?
Yeah, well, I think the key to what they did, and there's a difference now, I think they respected the law, but they understood that something had to be done, and in order to get the law to change, they had to violate what was an evil law. And I've talked to them about that, and the key for them was not that they were lawbreakers, but the key to them was that they were willing to pay the penalty for it. So they recognized that they were breaking the law, and King went to jail and Andy Young went to jail, and most of the civil rights leaders went to jail. And I would love to have a statistic, I guess we'll never have it, of the amount of bail money that the civil rights movement put up to make the points they were making in the 60s. So they were willing to pay the price, and it was a large price to get the attention of the country and our lawmakers so that they would change these laws that they thought were not good laws.
Bringing the civil rights background to your work now, what temperament does it take to be a judge?
They talk, one of the terms they ask you through confirmation that they're always talking about is a judicial temperament. Mm-hmm. I now understand that. I've always been deemed to be a fairly mellow kind of person, easygoing, but judging is very difficult. It's very frustrating, it's stressful, and a lot of judges that I know stress out and they don't have a judicial temperament. They get very short-tempered, they get frustrated, and very often attorneys see their job as frustrating the judge. So it takes a temperament where you can sit back and understand that two sides are advocating. One side is pushing the law as far as they ethically can this way and the other this way, and you're sort of in the middle trying to take this in and come out with a just ruling. It's stressful. It isn't easy, and I think it takes someone who is patient, ideally, and I don't think I've always been as patient as I should. None of us have, but patient, willing to learn, willing to listen, and willing to work hard, because very often you have to take things under submission and then go back with your law clerks and actually figure out a complicated area of law.
So it's a combination of things. It's your own personal experience in a way. It's how that experience helps you understand the facts of the case.
That's right.
The two arguments before you, weighing the two arguments, but also, I guess, in the context of precedent.
Yeah, it has to be in the context of precedent, because, and that's why I gave the example. The attorneys are pushing the precedent as far as they can in their direction. They're saying, this case stands for this principle. And it doesn't quite, but they're pushing it over. And they're saying, no, this case, or that's not the case. This other case is the one you should follow, and it stands for this principle. And you have to decipher all that, read the cases yourself, see which case applies, and then apply the law. As a judge, you're doing exactly what a jury does. I'm in a jury trial right now, and I will instruct the jury that they find out what the facts are. They will decide which witnesses they believe, and then I, the judge, will tell them what the law is. They put the law and the facts together to come up with a just ruling. Well, when you don't have a jury, that's exactly what the judge does. You put the facts and the law, but you have to follow the law.
In a particular case, there might be disappointment on the part of one community or communities because of the verdict. But I guess your long-term view is that there, and we could relate this to the civil rights experience, that there's really hope that the system will work its way to justice over time.
That's right. There is that hope. And the other important thing about our system, and I tell this to each jury after we finish, because they're usually drained on a tough case, and they've been through the same thing that judges go through. And I tell them that the key isn't whether you've made everybody happy, because you can't. And I tell them that the only thing that I, as a judge, make everyone happy on is when I do a wedding or I do an immigration swearing in, and everyone's happy. Everything else I do, at least half of the people are unhappy, because I'm ruling for someone and I'm therefore ruling against someone. What makes our system work so well, though, is to have one's day in court. The fact that that person presented the case, the jury listened to it, they had a chance to put on their case, and that's what sustains our system, is that having one's day in court, feeling you were heard, and even though you don't agree with the ruling, you feel you've been through a fair process.
In the 80s, before the end of apartheid in South Africa, you had the occasion to go there on one or another trip as a judicial observer.
Yes.
That must have been quite an experience, going to South Africa under apartheid. It was almost that you were thrust back into the 50s in the United States. Tell us a little about that experience.
It really was. It was a jarring experience. I went in 1985 with Leon Higginbottom, who at the time was an appellate court judge and sitting in Philadelphia, and Julius Chambers, who at the time was the head of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund in New York. And we were funded by the Carnegie Corporation. We all had civil rights background, and the idea was that we would go to South Africa as guests of the Black Lawyers Association in South Africa, share our American civil rights experience with them in hopes that we would afford insights in their ongoing struggle against apartheid. We would talk about strategies used in the civil rights movement. And it was a very, very fascinating experience, because we had all read about apartheid, but actually experiencing it and going throughout the country was quite another matter.
And the three of you were actually put under arrest at one point while you were observing a trial.
That's right. We went to Cape Town to observe a trial of 3 young blacks who were being tried for violation of the Anti-Terrorism Act. And at the break in the trial, we went outside, and a car drove up, and a fellow got out and talked to one of the lawyers who was hosting us. And the lawyer came back and said, "They want you to come down to the commandant's headquarters." And I thought, okay. So we got in a car and followed this car to a building, and were taken inside, and it was a small building with no windows. And we were put in this room where we began to be interrogated for the rest of the day. It was fairly intimidating because they had one guy in military garb who, when the tall lieutenant commander, he was called, was questioning us, this other fellow would get behind us, and he had a pipe in his hand. He would sort of whack it in his hand, sort of suggesting that if he didn't like our answers, he was going to crack our skull. So it was a very, very scary experience. Being quick of wit, I, at some point after quite a while, began to actually lie, and I probably shouldn't be saying this on television or something and recording it, but I began to say that we were guests of the U.S. ambassador, and that he was expecting us for dinner that night. I wanted to, so somebody's going to miss us. Actually, we had had dinner with him the previous evening, but this came into mind, and then we started getting some attention, and eventually we were released. But it was a scary experience.
If young people are studying the civil rights movement today, what lessons should they learn, do you think, from that dramatic period in American history?
Oh, I think one lesson is never give up fighting for your rights, because I think a great deal happened then, and I think a lot of brave young people were willing to put their safety on the line in a cause that was just. And I think there are still causes like that existing. I think perseverance is important. Involvement in your community activities, again, is important. I think those are some important lessons to learn out of that movement.
And what if there's a young person out there who says, well, look, I want to be a lawyer, but there are really no chances for me to get there from where I am now. What lessons should they read in your story?
Oh, I would say, young person, nonsense. See, you can make it because I made it. And if you had told me when I was growing up in Watts and didn't have a member of my family who'd ever gone to college that I would someday be a federal judge, I'm not sure I would have believed it then, but it happened. And as I said, I think my mother was right. Study hard and be ready for an opportunity, and they will come along.
And I'm reading from what you're saying that these experiences that you went through as a young person were very important for giving you the background to be the kind of judge you are today.
Oh, I think so. I think that's absolutely right. I think I have gotten some insights from these experiences which shape who I am as a judge, I think, in a number of ways. I think I bring some compassion. I was on television last night, and there was a brief article in the legal newspaper today that I was criticizing the sentencing guidelines, feeling that the sentences for certain kinds of crimes are much too harsh, and I believe that to be true. We're in a period, I think, of a punitive period where legislators want to just put people in jail, and there's very little rehabilitation. Now, this is born of my own background and own beliefs, yes.
In the beginning, you said that it was your mother who said, stick to the books, stick to the education. So if there's somebody in their background, in their life who's saying that, they should listen.
They should listen very closely. Mother knows best, or sometimes father knows best if he's saying it.
And in the end, really, the thread running through your story is really education, and that was really the key to making the difference for you.
Education was absolutely the key for me. I think without the education, I wouldn't be where I was. And I told the story of my mother one day coming home when I was beginning to be a pretty good football player, and the other kids on the team, you know, they'd go home, they'd go play at night and go to the parties, and I had homework because we had 2 tracks in our school, an academic and shop. In the shop, you take print, shop, and that was it, no homework. And I thought, gee, that's neat. Well, it's clear to me if I had gone that route, when Mr. McClellan came on the field that day, I wouldn't have been ready to go to Cal. I was ready to go to Cal when he found me and helped me do that.
What do you say to a student who says, well, but I don't know how to prepare? In other words, what I should be doing now? Any thoughts for them other than just follow the path of their schooling?
If the kid really means it, there will be people who will help. There was always someone to help me, and I've mentioned some of them. There are teachers who will help. They will tell you how to do it, because I didn't know how to do it. As I told you, Mr. McClellan had to help me fill out the application to get into college. There are people who will help, and I would say to listen. If you really want to do it, if you really want to get out of whatever community you're in and go to college, I'm absolutely convinced it can be done. I wasn't the smartest kid at Jeff, and I've told that story, although very few of us got out of Jeff and went to college. You can do it.
And will there be a role for civil rights lawyers in the future?
I think there will. I think there will be a role for civil rights lawyers, because I think there are still civil rights problems to be solved.
One final question. How does a judge relax?
Well, I relax. I love to fish.
I see.
Fishing I call my sanity time. I go fishing as often as I can, and there is something very quieting and calming about, and I fly fish now, about going, sitting on a beautiful body of water, putting on your fly, throwing it out there, just watching it drift downstream. That's all you're thinking about. And every now and then a trout will grab it and you pull it in. That's what I love to do.
And because of your judicial background and temperament, I can assume you never exaggerate the size of what you've caught.
I never exaggerate. They're all that big.
Okay. Judge Henderson, thank you very much for coming back to Berkeley for this conversation with history.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation.